Mahyar Tousi, I'm not going to put words into your mouth, but I would imagine you would support the Thatcherite concept of sound money. Are we ever going to get that back, the whole idea that we can't spend more than we can afford?
I mean, you're absolutely right. The issue I have is that, firstly, I appreciate that politicians from both parties have to be very cautious and careful with wording and what they say. But when obviously Ash Sarkar obviously suggested that debt is always there, long-term debt, and basically it doesn't really matter short term, and austerity is a bad word. I think that's the biggest problem. There's only one solution that we as humans, at least in the West, have discovered over the last century or so when it comes to these sort of problems. One is growth and creating wealth, and the other is austerity. I know austerity is a bad word, but it's because, again, in terms of language, it has become a bad word. It's not supposed to be. It's not supposed to be you're going to hit the poor and you're going to help the rich. Austerity simply means making sure that you have good bookkeeping when it comes to the treasury and the government budget.
But it does austerity does hit the poor more than it does the rich, doesn't it? I mean, no one can deny that.
Well, it really depends what we mean by it, because you still have a situation where, for example, I'm not going to get into the details of what happened previously with the coalition. For example, the coalition government made a decision to cut the frontline pay and salaries, at the same time not making proper actual cuts overall. And that was a bad decision. I'm not even going to defend the coalition government, but as a concept, good bookkeeping, or as Margaret Thatcher said, good housekeeping is a good idea. But let's not focus too much on the austerity part of it, but in terms of wealth creation and in terms of growth, there's one system that we've created in the West over the few decades and century or so, which is free market capitalism, a market economy. If you want to get out of debt, and to be fair, the debt that we have in the West, all the countries in the West, is going to be difficult to actually pay off. We're not going to be able to pay it off anytime soon, but it's about being able to make it slightly better with the deficit and everything else. There's no other solution. You protect the frontline public services, the essential public services, at the same time, allow individuals and businesses to grow, to be able to actually create more revenue.
Mar, you were nodding along to the Preston bit of what Ash said there, much to my surprise.
I'm going to say something interesting. It's quite rare, but I'm going to say partly I agree with what Ash said in terms of when her approach is to localize more. I absolutely agree, and we need more scrutiny when it comes to contracts and everything else, and local services. The two issues I have is firstly the 4-day week or anything like that. I understand that a lot of times with a modern economy that we have, even right now with the lockdown or semi-lockdown, a lot of people work from home. There's still a massive impact on other parts of the economy, where there's high streets and other local shops that people don't really go to offices anymore. But I think the biggest problem that we have is that we don't really have a proper solution. I'm not just talking about the government, but any other party at this point, because we have obviously a lot of interventionist policies, we have a lot of good words, but we don't really have any direct policies that could actually help us, as I said earlier, grow the economy. And everything is all about the state is going to be helping you. Whereas in reality, this is a method that we've been trying for years and years. Ash just said earlier that this is the economy that's been failing for some time. In fact, just before the coronavirus and the pandemic and everything else, the economy in this country over the last few years has been going really well. And then, we brought down the deficit. We've been growing. The GDP has been growing. And jobs being obviously
fairly anemically, it has to be. Mahyar Tousi, do you think the 10 o'clock curfew is working? I think it's been in operation for 10 days. I'm not even sure how long you have to take to judge whether something is working or not.
Well, firstly, let me just say that in the first segment, I said I agree with Ash Sarkar. In this segment, I'm going to say, in terms of rhetoric, I agree with Keir Starmer in terms of the opposition to the 10 p.m. curfew. But to be serious, we know for a fact at this point that these decisions, especially the recent measures, whether it's the 10 p.m. curfew or the rule of 6, were actually political. And they came from the cabinet. And there were even government, obviously health experts, who were still quite skeptical towards the evidence about this. I'm not going to go completely radical and say, talk about Sweden or anything like that. But even in terms of the current situation in this country, we know, and you have mentioned it, Ian, yourself, the backlash, the counterproductiveness about this 10 p.m. curfew, that you actually get more people to go out because there are more people at 10 p.m. than at 2 a.m. When people leave the bars at 2 a.m., you might say they might be drunk, but there are few of them, and they use different methods to get home. It hasn't actually worked anyway. The issue we have is that there's absolutely no evidence for the science behind this. Even people like Sir Patrick Vallance has complained recently about the government actually not listening to them in terms of the scientific evidence on this. So it's interesting that I'm defending, obviously, previously Ash Sarkar, then Sir Keir Starmer, and now Sir Patrick Vallance on this. Just a quick thing. Having said that, obviously I criticise the government at this point, but just a quick thing in terms of what Justin Matters said himself earlier, that he literally, I quote him, he said, "We support any measures." So Keir Starmer said the same. My issue is that, we could criticise the government at this point, but we need a good opposition. When you have an opposition party where they basically just say, we agree with anything the government does, and then when it doesn't work, they just criticise them, they blame everything on Boris Johnson, that's also a big problem.
Maya, how would you answer that?
Obviously, on the surface, you would always go with the government because they are responsible. I fully understand that. But this is a system we've created over the last few decades, actually, where you got the bureaucratic side of government, most of the time not really accountable. When you have a situation where test and trace as a project hasn't worked, where you have a situation where HS2 isn't working, and you can name a lot of other projects where institutionally they don't really work. And yes, you could always blame the politicians and obviously the government. They are responsible. But at the end of the day, you could fire a minister. You could replace him with someone else. If you don't address the real deep problem of the system, it doesn't really help. And I fully understand that, for example, with test and trace and all the recent decisions, I appreciate that ministers in government and the Prime Minister had a tough time because they had to make decisions quite urgently with everything else. They've been in a rush. But at the end of the day, they have to be responsible, and I don't think that it's been easy for them. Test and trace should completely be scrutinized as a project, and when the government, unfortunately, all I'm going to say is that they are the victim of the monster that they've created. They were very successful initially to obviously scare people enough to go into the lockdown. And now, since then, they've been run by the media and obviously the likes of Piers Morgan, who basically have been pushing for certain things. And every decision has been political, not scientific.
That's a bit of a gross generalisation to say that every decision has been political. They're presumably taking advice from the scientific community and then making a decision. Sometimes they may agree with the scientists, sometimes they may not.
Of course, no, I agree. It has certain decisions you could say that a lot of them were suggested by Sage.
Yeah, but you said every decision.
Well, yes, but I do believe that at the end of the day, the decisions that were made, obviously the suggestions that they received from their own scientific advisors and obviously medical officers, at the end of the day, the way it looks, obviously I'm not inside the government, and I do understand that ministers and the Prime Minister have great intentions. They want to take care of the country. The way it looks from the outside is that they received the suggestions, but they're still political.
Maya, you've been a bit of a lefty tonight.
Well, okay, firstly, just because I agree with Ash and Keir Starmer doesn't mean...
I'm sorry.
To clarify, I think that comment that came to you guys, I think that basically means that both main parties are now essentially interventionists and essentially left-wing. That's the situation we have. But I agree with, obviously, Paul Scully. I'm similar to him, obviously free market, but also socially liberal. And, I criticise the government tonight a lot, but at the same time, firstly, the Labour Party don't have any alternative, but also I know that Paul and other ministers are working really hard. But overall, the main two parties, there are more similarities than differences.
The biggest recent mistake by this government?
Listening to the mainstream media and allowing the media to create and shift the narrative in terms of everything that's been happening economically, but also the pandemic in general. I have a feeling that a lot of people in government could have made different decisions on the basis of whether it was science or economics.
Who in the mainstream media has the power to shift government policy?
So I don't agree with any sort of conspiracy theories. It's not like they had a meeting one day and said let's go with this. It's just a mentality that this country has had with the media essentially going with the fear that they created. I'm not saying that you shouldn't take this situation seriously. All I'm saying that the biggest mistake overall has been that Boris Johnson has always been seen as a strong, independent character, as a leader. I'm going to do what I want and what I believe. And over the last 6 months, it doesn't look like that he is. It seems like everything that the mainstream media have been pushing, the government have been following.
But sorry, who are these people in the so-called mainstream media? What have they been pushing, and who are they?
I mean, from the likes of obviously Piers Morgan to your.
Well, they don't put ministers up on Piers Morgan's programme, so I don't imagine they're listening to him very much.
Of course not, but I do have a feeling that this government, just like the Blair government, are run by opinion polls and focus groups and the media. So the fact that right now in the opinion polls, still about 70% are still pro lockdown measures because of the fear that the media and the government have created over the last 6 months.